Have you ever been concerned that a lot of job hopping would ultimately hurt your career? Or maybe you've been tempted to leave your job that you like to try to get more pay somewhere else? Or maybe better yet, you're a hiring manager, a resume slides across your desk, and you see that the person's never stayed in any of their jobs for more than 1 year, and you just don't know if they're worth the risk to hire. Well, we're going to answer all of those questions and more on a special episode of Per My Last Email with creator, influencer, and I would say icon, Hanna Goefft. Okay, so we're in the studio with Hanna Goefft. You might have noticed if you're watching on YouTube, something's a little different. Well, yeah, we have a whole other person here. And I'm so excited for this episode and to have Hanna join us. She is the creator of Hanna Gets Hired. She's on TikTok, Instagram, probably all the other channels you can imagine, giving, I think, some of the best career advice out there. She's grown her channels like exponentially, and it's been really cool to see. And she's a friend of the podcast. So we wanted to bring her on to talk about job hopping, particularly because I think she has really good takes in that department. So Hanna, thank you so much for joining us in studio.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Kaila. I am so excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's get into it. And maybe we start just with a definition, because that, sexy. Everyone wants to talk definitions right away.
Yeah.
But just so we're all on the same page, what actually does job hopping mean? And Kaila, I know maybe you have a take on what this actually is.
Webster's Dictionary. No, I think my take on what job hopping is that it's changed quite a bit in the last 3 to 5 years because of a variety of reasons. But I think in the olden days, job hopping was you have spent 5 years at a job and then you left instead of your whole starting at the bottom, now we're here kind of vibes, all the way up from day one to CEO. So I think that's changed a lot. Now I would define job hopping as I'd say, well, let's say one job every 18 months. What do you think, Hanna?
I think the hardest part about this question is that people will define it differently, and there isn't a set definition. I think generally a year to 2 years represents what could be construed as a short stint, but the nature of the whole conversation is that it is subjective based on who's doing the hiring and who's doing the evaluating, and depending on who that is and probably what generation and work culture they're from, that definition might skew a little bit. But I would say rule of thumb is about a year or 2 years, 18 months.
And I think this is what's the most interesting part of this conversation is the perception of it. You can all have very different definitions, but if you're oh, I'm not a job hopper, I'm staying in most jobs 2+ years, and you go to a job and the hiring manager maybe is of an older generation, they might think you're a flight risk, even though you don't perceive that, and all of your coworkers, all of your friends are doing it a similar cadence. There was a stat from a resume lab that said 83% of workers consider themselves to be a job hopper. So most people are now kind of owning this title, which I think is different than generations past.
Yeah.
And then the average millennial is staying in a job 2.75 years on average. And 21% of millennials changed jobs last year, which is 3 times more than other generations. So I think just bringing up those stats to highlight there is some generational differences in people's perception of job hopping. Hanna, I'm not sure the exact makeup of your audience, but I'm assuming you're talking to a lot of millennials, maybe Gen Z. Do you feel that sense of difference in generations of perception of job hopping and thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely have an audience that skews more Gen Z millennial. So I think the biggest thing that I've noticed is there's very much a sentiment on social media that job hopping is one of the best ways to advance, grow your income, which is true in a lot of cases, but it can't just be this blanket statemented thing. And again, going back to the perception, if you're a Gen Z interviewing for a job and the hiring manager is a boomer or, somebody higher up the food chain, their perception of your background may change depending on what they've seen, what industries they've been in.
It is so interesting because on social, there's all of these influencers that are corporations hate you.
Yeah.
They don't care about you. You should leave the second you get more money. And that might be true, TBD.
It probably
have your own take. But what I think is the wrong way to take that is if you do follow that path forever, eventually it stops working. The short-term incentive for you to leave a job and make more money makes sense. But if you do that every 6 months, okay, like 3 years into it, on your like 9th employer, they're gonna be like, we get it. The jig is up here. So I'm worried that people take a short-term incentive and keep repeating it, and it ultimately ends up hurting their career long term. Where I would say like having a decent tenure at one company, even if it's not perfect, actually does teach you a lot of lessons, and it like gives you a little bit of more credibility in the marketplace when you go to try and find another job.
I think people really hate the fact that like a job is a transactional thing, and a lot of employees are like, what's the real reason you want this job? Well, I need a freaking paycheck. So, you're never going to say that in an interview, but the reality is like companies are going through a swath of candidates. Candidates are usually vying for like one or a couple of jobs. So companies, for the most part, are looking for somebody that is excited, or is motivated, is like there for more than just the paycheck.
Yeah, they're passionate about the mission, like whatever it might be.
And they're going to look for signals in someone's background to indicate how likely they are to succeed, how much value they may be able to drive, how long they're going to stick around. And like the broken aspect of the hiring process is that's really hard to gauge until you like actually start to work with somebody. But the best proxies, the best signals recruiters and hiring managers have are these little indications on a resume. How long have you been at past roles? How many short stints have you had across a broad span of time?
I think that's such a good point, and perhaps the best point that's ever been made on this podcast. Because
Wrap it up.
Give me so
Podcast
much
over.
credit.
No, it's so smart because it makes complete sense, right? It's like you are, especially now in the age of like AI applications, where the last time I was hiring, I got over 1,000 applications within a week. And you have to use Kyle's favorite word, heuristics, to decide who am I going to even interview, who am I going to talk to. And if you're seeing, you're wanting somebody who's going to have a very successful long-term career, even if for millennial hirers, long-term may be 2 years.
Yeah.
If you're seeing somebody that's done, 9 jobs in 3 years, of course, you're going to be less likely to want to hire that person because you don't want to have to do this again in 3 months.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I had polled my audience and gotten a few perspectives from recruiters because I was really curious, like, to hear, especially after COVID. I think COVID really changed the sentiment around this, changed kind of the resume landscape and the hiring landscape. There definitely is a lot more appetite for hops or shorter stints on resumes now because of COVID, because there were so many layoffs. But I heard from a couple different recruiters that the kind of general sentiment is like 1 to 2 years, but it's all contextual. So if somebody has a short stint in 2020 and then they've moved maybe a couple short stints, even then, like there's more grace given for something like that. But if somebody has a period of 6 different jobs prior to COVID where they've had a number of short stints, like that's a much more significant red flag. I think it can depend on the industry as well. Like my take on it is that what matters a lot more than the image on the resume is the story that you can tell around it. And that story should come out in the way you're putting your resume together. But if you're in a job where innovation happens really fast, or your time to output is much quicker, maybe you're in marketing where you're like running campaigns every month and you can quantify success and value quickly, there might be a bigger appetite for a shorter stint compared to something like an engineering role where you're working for months and months, even years, to get new products out the door.
Yeah, I was going to say that I just think that context is so important because also like it could be a thing where you were like laid off. Which like definitely is also a thing you're going to need to combat with story, but it is different than necessarily choosing to leave under your own volition. So I think that context piece is just so important.
I think that the term job hopping also, it implies that you're the one choosing to hop, I guess. But like right now, there's so many things that like it's on the company side, like layoffs, restructuring, also like extremely toxic cultures that push people out, lack of upward mobility. All of those things are things that would technically be on the company side. So it's like not really the person's fault.
I hear you, but I worry like, it's like one of those things where it's like if you meet like an asshole in the morning, they're the asshole. If you meet an asshole in midday, they're the asshole. If you meet an asshole at night, you're probably the asshole. Like, if someone says the last 7 jobs I've had have all been toxic, I'm like,
Sure.
Right.
Okay,
Then you're
like,
like,
are you sure?
problem?
Yeah. What?
Yeah.
So I think you can use that excuse, and it might be a valid excuse, like once or twice. But if you're over relying on that reason being the one that you're job hopping, I think some people are just gonna be like, I don't, quite frankly, don't believe you.
Right. I think it is all about the story, and I think that's very important. But also, I think like, especially at companies that are kind of like LIFO layoffs, so like last in,
Yes.
first out. You can get into
favorite
this, like,
accounting term.
I don't know what that's
Multiple applications.
I don't know if that's a thing that we can.
No,
but,
I mean,
like,
yeah,
I don't know
it
how
is.
else to describe it, but like, if you get into that cycle where you were laid off at one place because of COVID or because of like changing, macroeconomic situation, and then you go to a new place and then they do layoffs, it's like, it might actually not be your fault that you're getting like pushed around, and that's a really hard thing to name and to storytell into getting a future role.
But a great way to combat that is to literally just put impacted by layoffs on a resume. Like, you'll probably scroll on LinkedIn and see people with chunks of experience during the like pandemic, post-pandemic years that will say impacted by department cuts or whatever. And that is to signal to the hiring manager or recruiter, like, this is not by choice.
Yeah.
And it's just simple, it's small, and I can understand the vulnerability involved in it, putting it out there publicly, but like, I've heard from recruiters that just that signal can make a big difference in how they're perceived. Because I heard from a recruiter from Inside Global who said many of the hiring managers she works with will sit down in an interview and go like job by job, fine tooth comb through someone's resume, wanting to know why they left each role and what the story was. And it really is that like picking out for the red flags, like what can we learn from this person based on the things they might not be telling us about past roles.
I think that's like a really, really great tactic and not one that I had thought about before. And also, I think in general, there has been like a normalization of being affected by layoffs.
Yeah.
I think
100%.
it might not be like a badge of honor, but it's people aren't like as ashamed of it as maybe they used to be. But I also think like it does humanize you. And a hiring manager is probably someone who's been affected by layoffs themselves in the past. And I think it is something that they're like, oh, they can relate to. And my personal opinion is someone that has been affected by a layoff probably would be the most loyal worker at your company if you were to hire them, because they know like the real sadness it is when you do get affected by that and they're ready to like get back to work and feel like they're, providing value and like have colleagues and all that. So I think there's a way to reframe it where you're actually like less of a risk having gone through some of that stuff than more of a risk.
I'll also add to contract roles. Contract roles, a lot of people post layoffs had to move into contract roles. I think companies had an easier time hiring contractors than full-time employees because there are no benefits costs and it's like often a different approval process. And contract roles usually come with a specified end date. So maybe you're only at that job for a year. Without that context on a resume, it looks like you joined somewhere and dipped after a year. But if you put contract, like even LinkedIn has a feature where you can tag that it's a contract job. Again, that's a signal to a hiring manager that this wasn't by choice. This was kind of the structure of that role, and you are looking for that longevity.
I think the like root of this and like the conversation that we're having right now is that job hopping can be a decision. It can be a choice that you make, and it can be like a bad choice. It can be a signal maybe that you're getting pushed out, or that maybe there's something like that's preventing you from having a successful long-term career at a company. But there are also like, you can have the same perception, but not have that be the core reason. And so one of the tactics that I'm like getting from this conversation is making sure that you're telling your story appropriately and understanding the reason behind the job, quote unquote, hop. If it's your decision, if it's not, like it could be to get more skills, to like, be more of like a generalist, which is something we've talked about in the past.
There's a quote from Kat Cole, who is the CEO of AG1 now, and she said, in her career, learning is my currency. So she knew that she was ready to leave her current role if she just ran out of learning opportunities. But if she still had them, she would stick around. And again, I think having that like mantra or that through line that you could tell a hiring manager, I loved my role. I kind of reached the point where I wasn't learning enough. And there wasn't more opportunities for me at this company, and that's why I'm coming to you. It's like a really positive reframe.
And we'll be right back after this. Okay, back to the show.
I want to get into like the psyche of deciding to job hop by actually asking you two like what went through your minds when you decided to do a job hop in your own career. So Hannah, I know you've done some, Kaila, I know you've done some. So maybe Hannah, like walk me through what was going through your mind when you made a decision to job hop.
Yeah, absolutely. And like if you were to look at my resume, you'd be like, what the hell is this girl thinking? It's a little all over the place, but I think I've been able to configure the stories along the way so it can make sense. But I, fun fact, started my career out of college in accounting. I worked for Deloitte in San Francisco, and
when we said LIFO, you lit up.
Oh yeah, no, I was an accountant. I got my
That's an
CPA.
accountant.
I did the whole thing.
I didn't know that. That's
I don't know why. I knew from like day one that I didn't want to do that, but that's a whole other story. And so very quickly into that job, I knew it wasn't what I wanted to do. I would like take the ferry home to my parents' house and cry.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was kind of the point where I started to look around being like, what the hell is out here for me? I have no idea. But I knew even this whole sphere wasn't the career path I wanted to be in. So my MO at the time was just like, get out, like go do something else. I wasn't as concerned with kind of saving resume face as much because like I had a year of work experience and
it might just get to a point where it's so bad too. You're like, I don't even care what the perception is.
right.
I can't be crying
Yeah.
in
I
the ferry.
didn't, there wasn't anything in that job that was necessarily going to lend itself to the next job that I needed to stick around for. So I ended up moving into a recruiting role, an executive recruiting role that just gave me a ton of exposure into other industries and jobs. But making that decision, I mean, I'm definitely, I hope I'm wiser now than I was at the time, but because I had so few ties to that career path and really there wasn't anything left there for me, making a pivot was more about getting myself onto the right track as quickly as I could so I could build years of experience following a direction I wanted to at a point in my career where like a year stint wasn't going to matter as much. I only had 1 year of experience in total. Most hiring managers at that point probably don't really care what you're doing as long as you can show you're smart and competent in some ways. And then my most recent corporate job, I was in marketing. I was working for a recruiting software company, and I was able to pivot into that by like using the through lines from my recruiting experience. I landed in a recruitment marketing role, and that was much more definitively a path I did want to stay on. I had worked really hard to pivot into marketing. And then when I first got into that role, I realized there was a lot about it I didn't love. I wasn't necessarily set up for the most success. Like things weren't working the way they should have been. And there was a period where I was evaluating, like about 6 months in, where I was like, should I leave? Like I'm really frustrated. I'm doing a lot of the recruiting work that I was just had my gears ground by. And that was a much bigger concern that would be perceived as hobby, especially because I had made so many pivots. And so what I ended up doing instead was focusing on pivoting internally, seeing how I could get involved with other parts of the marketing org, other projects, so that I could get closer to the work that I wanted to do without having to completely leave entirely and start over. And actually, thinking back to that first job, a regret I do have was not exploring internal pivots earlier because Deloitte is such a big organization. They have like an internal marketing agency. If I was savvier than I was at 22, I would have gone and tried to meet people in that marketing agency and seen if there was any room for me to get involved otherwise. But for the sake of not having that short stint, like it is worthwhile to look around and see what other internal opportunities are, because chances are like companies need help in every department. And if you are smart, if you show you're committed, if you show you're willing to like learn and put in the effort to help out other places, you can probably find ways to get involved in other things that you'll like.
I think that is an incredible tactic as well. Like before you hop, like see if like something in your own company is available for you to pivot into, and at least you have then more leverage when you are job hopping to know what else is out there. Kaila, rank yourself on the hoppiness scale. Are you hopping about or what?
I don't think I'm very hoppy, but I do want to like outline something that I saw on Reddit when I was looking for stats on.
I'm glad you admitted where you found it. Instead of being like, I was
also
reading
looked
in the
at
New
Reddit,
York
I will not lie.
Reddit is actually wonderful for like actual real people anecdotes. But what somebody was saying was that the prejudice against job hopping is more negative towards people that are in small companies.
Yeah.
Because job hopping doesn't really count, that perception doesn't count when you're talking internal. So if you're technically, like, I've job hopped like 4 times now in Morning Brew.
Yeah.
But I've been in Morning Brew for 4 years. So like if I'm looking for another job, which I'm not, so just note that.
Let the record show.
Let the record show that I'm not looking for another job. But if I was, I would be able to say I've spent 4 years at Morning Brew, even though my path here has been like a ping pong ball. Like it doesn't make any sense. And that's fine. And I've been really enjoying it. But it's like I can really like message whatever I want out of this without having that job hopping narrative necessarily. And so I think that that's a tough thing. It's also a really good tactic if you want to avoid it. Like if you want to avoid job hopping or you want to avoid external interviewing, even if it's a small company, figuring out like what you can do.
And I will say the value of a small company, I think, is that there's so much need.
Yeah.
Like there's just so many problems and few people that can help solve them. That depends on the culture, but in like startup culture is stereotypical that you can kind of wear a lot of hats. You can play a generalist role. If you really hate your job, like you may be able to talk to your manager or leadership about getting involved in something else and eventually making a full pivot. I had a friend that I think he was in like customer service or something and ended up doing a software engineering boot camp. It took a couple of years of like working with the team, but eventually was able to do a complete 180 career pivot into a software engineering role without leaving the startup that he loved working at because it was a great group of people.
What was that woman who you said worked in marketing but wanted to be a producer? And she just sat next to
Cleo Abrams.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she has like a very similar story and now is doing incredible things. Do you think there's a difference in job hopping optimization based on where you're at in your career? Like, and Hanna, you were obviously an executive recruiter. You might have a lot of insight here. Like, is there a sense where, okay, you're young, so you should be hopping more. You're more senior, so you can hop and people, already know you. Like, what's your take on seniority and the willingness to be hoppy?
Yes. So one of the most interesting insights that I think I got out of being an executive recruiter is how careers are holistically evaluated. The more senior you get, it becomes a lot less of like, what have you done in recent years? What technical skills do you have? And more about like, what is the comprehensive story you can tell? And it becomes more important for each individual job and experience to fit together into a bigger story. So maybe you've done the startup thing in one stint and then you did the bigger company thing and now you want to show you can be this like full breadth CEO at the end of your career. So at the executive level, and even if you aren't intending to become an executive, but you do want to progress in seniority at least to some extent, there is more importance around, again, the story that you can tell within each job. But by that, I mean, what impact did you drive? What can you hang your hat on? Like what resume bullets can you conjure out of each individual role? And I think that matters more than tenure. Again, I think tenure is just the proxy to whoever's looking at your resume. But the chances that you can really get some good, solid work done and progress done for the compensation you're likely being paid and the level that you're hired at, if you're an executive, you're probably there to be really strategic and deliver something over the long term. Like you're probably not going to be able to deliver all that much in under a year, and staying for less than a year becomes, or even less than a couple of years, becomes a greater signal that something went wrong.
And I mean, I hear all the time too, like the process to hire an executive is so thorough.
Gosh, it takes months. It can take like 6 months.
Right. It costs a ton of money. And then if that person were to leave, like within a year, it would be a complete waste of time.
Right.
And now you have to reset your whole process.
Yeah.
So I do think if you're at that point in your career, the ability to at least be perceived as like a stable investment for the company is super important. Where like, I think junior employees, whether it's correct or not, are viewed as a little more like dispensable.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, you've done 3 jobs with 1 year. Like, that's fine. Like, come in, make an impact. We'll find like another one of you is, I think a lot of the times the take there. I also think when you're more junior, like collecting a lot of experiences is really important. And so you could do that by pivoting internally, but you could also do that by job hopping. And then you kind of have this like breadth of skills where then if you want to go deep and like stay at a company for 5, 6, 7 years, you've already got a really strong base. And so I do feel like that would be my general advice is like when you're young, you want to gain a lot of skills as fast as possible. You can't job hop all the time because people might perceive that as like you're flighty. But if that's internally pivoting or really smart job hops to gain those skills, do that as fast as possible. And then I would go deep on one company, even though that's not what I've really done at all. Cause I think I'm like a bit of like a loyalist.
Yeah.
Like
You've had some pivots, you know, you've tried on different
that is
different
true.
things
So maybe I have done that, but like Morning Brew, I'm like, it's been 4 years and
I have no intention of
I'm like a simp for Morning Brew. Yeah.
But I feel like that's the kind of career progression is like you're at that point in your career where you've reached a level of seniority and you're like, okay, let me take everything I've done and accomplished and really double down and like inject it into this thing and drive impact.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think I would give like my tactic, which is something I'm pulling out of thin air, is like I feel like what you mentioned, the 1 year, I did the same thing. It was like 18 months and I was like, I got to get out of finance. So same deal. I was like, I really don't care what I'm doing next. I just can't do this. But then from there, I spent 3 years at my next company and now 4 years here. I think you have like 3 job hops before it's like, okay, this is becoming a pattern. I'd love to like, you either have to be really, really good at storytelling or you have to like settle in and like, or there's like a red flag.
Yeah.
I feel like if it's 3 years, 3 different jobs, that's when as a hiring manager, I would be like, I need more context before I make a decision on if this person would be set up for success at our company. But I think that that's probably like maybe just the slight modification of like the boomer take of job hopping. So I don't know if I'm like in the right there, but I think that's my advice or how I would view it.
Yeah.
I want to almost like flip this back to like the employer side of things because there was some research from I think it was Gallup, don't quote me on this, but it was showing that a lot of people, the reason they job hop is because they want to make more money. And like we've heard this over and over again where people want an internal promotion, they want to make more compensation, the company's like no, and they're like, okay, then I'm gonna leave and get it. And so they did a study and they found it's more effective to like get an increase that beats inflation by leaving your company than it is to stay at the company. And so also part of this is like I'm kind of forced to job hop if I do want to make more money. Is there a way for companies to like combat this? Will that ever change? Or is that just
More money.
that just like the new world we're in where like you're gonna have to leave to make more money? Like how should you go about going against that narrative?
I think you can also like shop around if that's what you're looking for. Is like, I want to make more money. I know I'm underpaid in the market. Well, prove it. Get yourself a job offer that is for, let's say, like 10% higher than you're making now, and then show that to your current company. And then it's basically a win-win, right? You already have the job offer in hand. And if you're a company, which maybe you want to keep working for them, is willing to pay 10% more, they'll pay 10% more.
Yeah.
And I think that could be an interesting thing. I also want to point out that the money isn't necessarily everything
100%.
that you would get when you like stay at a company. I think I'm very pro hopping around to increase your salary, but also like one of the reasons why I wouldn't hop around, even though I've kind of pivoted a bunch in my career here at Morning Brew, is the comfort that you have from already having proven yourself and already having built your reputation at one place. I think there's something that we don't really talk about a lot that is so nice about like being able to relax into your skills and your knowledge a little bit versus feeling like this is an entirely new environment, entirely new set of people. They all they know is what's on my resume, and they're judging me on what's on my resume. And now I need to prove that I'm competent and that I can do this and that I can go above and beyond if needed. And like, whereas now, not saying that I'm not working hard, but I'm not as stressed and I'm not working as hard every single day to be like, guys, I know what I'm doing. I promise. You know, I'm like, oh no, these people know what I'm doing.
You don't have to waste any energy proving yourself. People already know you're talented here. So like you don't have that in the background. You could just do your job and be great at it. And I think that does relieve a lot of stress from your existence at work.
Like I almost even like I could probably, again, I'm not doing this, but I could probably like interview elsewhere and like find a job with higher pay. But I'm like, I think it's worth the comfort of my day to day now.
Yeah.
Of like knowing that the decisions I aren't going to be like questioned.
Yeah.
Or that people are going to trust me. I don't have to rebuild that trust. That's worth me not even shopping around.
And I think that's a privilege that comes from years of experience.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, early in anyone's career, like there may be more need to hop to
Yeah.
build financial stability. You may not have as much of an option if you're living paycheck to paycheck,
Exactly.
and you need to just go where the money is. And for employers to fault like professionals earlier on or at any point in their career for doing that to earn a living wage is like, you know,
Completely agree.
yeah, it should change. But and then just for, you know, there's so many jobs out there that people hate. Like there's so many people that are miserable at work, and money is not the only factor of what is going to make you unmiserable at work. And to your point, like finding an environment that values you, that you can do your best work in, you can flourish in a way, especially with that longer amount of time. Like there is, and interestingly, I don't have the stat, but over the past couple of years, I believe younger generations have been prioritizing well-being and work-life balance at work over salary. They're ranking that higher in terms of preferences. And so there is kind of a move of people towards companies and jobs where you're going to get that like comfort level instead of just always hopping around to get a new salary.
I wonder if we're going to see job hopping decrease then.
I think with the competitiveness of the past year, it has certainly. Like
Yeah.
the numbers, the percentages of people that are wanting to look for a new job from 2023 to 2024 have decreased significantly.
Very interesting. I think you both bring up a good point, which it comes down to like know what you're trying to optimize for. And it probably should be salary or a few other things. And I also feel like it's like job hopping, we feel like is already sexy. It's like, oh, I'm getting a new job. I'm making more money. This is really cool. But if we are going to shift back to this, like you're staying at a company a little longer, I feel like we need to make like staying at a company sexy again. Like I do think you can only live one life. And so job hopping has its perks, but also staying at a company, feeling comfortable, really understanding your colleagues, moving around internally is also very beneficial. There was that big story about the current Nike CEO who's been at Nike literally his own career. And like, he doesn't know what job hopping is, but we also don't know what it's like to like work at one place for 30 years.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that is also just as rewarding for a certain type of person. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's like one right answer, but I think bringing up these different perspectives, very helpful. Hanna,
Yes.
people listen to you on the podcast. They love you. They want to find more of you. How does someone follow Hanna Gets Hired?
TikTok and Instagram. It's you know, I bet after this podcast I'll probably show up on your feed somewhere. But TikTok, Instagram, I post from time to time more about creator things on LinkedIn. I'm Hanna Gets Hired on the video socials and Hanna Goefft on LinkedIn.
Love it.
Easy
Well,
as that.
thank you so much for
Yes,
joining
this was
us.
so fun.
You.
Love the
Let's
conversation.
do it again sometime.
Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Per My Last Email.
Should we roll the credits?
Let's do it. Our producer has been Kaila Heck.
Our technical director is Uchenna Ogu.
Cameron Abbas is our senior designer.
And our chief content officer is Devin Emery.
This show is a production of Morning Brew.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.